David had always dreamed of a quiet place near the water. For many years, he lived in the city where the sound of traffic never rested and the air felt heavy with smoke. His job had kept him busy, and even though he earned enough to live comfortably, he always felt something was missing. He wanted peace, a slower life, and a home where he could hear the sound of birds instead of car horns. One summer, after months of searching, David found a small cabin near a clear blue lake. The cabin wasn't large or fancy, but it had everything he wanted. The wooden walls were old yet strong, the porch faced the water, and the breeze carried the fresh scent of pine trees. The lake itself sparkled in the morning sun, and in the evenings, the surface turned golden as the sun set behind the hills. For David, it was more than just a cabin. It was a dream finally turning into reality. When he first moved in, David spent hours walking around the lake, learning the paths and greeting the neighbors he met along the way. Some waved with warm smiles, while others only nodded politely. The small community around the lake was managed by something called an HOA Homeowners Association. David had heard of HOAs before, but he never paid much attention. He believed it was simply a group that kept the neighborhood clean and organized. At least, that was what he thought in the beginning. During his first week, everything felt perfect. He placed a small chair on the porch, where he would sit with a cup of tea each morning. He started building a small wooden dock so he could fish or just let his feet dangle above the water. He even planted flowers by the cabin door to make the place brighter. For the first time in years, David felt at peace. But peace has a way of attracting storms. It happened on his second weekend at the cabin. David was fixing a loose step on his porch when he heard the sound of hurried footsteps. A woman with sharp eyes and a notebook in her hand was walking toward him. Her name was Karen. She introduced herself as the head of the HOA, and before David could say more than hello, she began listing problems. "Your dock is too close to the lake path," she said quickly, pointing at the wooden beams he had worked so hard to place. "You also need to check the paint on your porch. It does not match the approved colors." David blinked in surprise. He had only just settled in, and already, he was being told what he could and could not do. He tried to explain that the dock was still unfinished, that he planned to adjust it, but Karen only scribbled something in her notebook. That was the beginning. In the days that followed, David learned more about the HOA than he ever wanted to. Karen seemed to appear whenever he was outside. If he was mowing the grass, she would remind him of the exact length it should be. If he was fixing a light by the porch, she would mention the brightness level allowed in the community. David started to feel that every simple joy, every little improvement was being watched and judged. At first, he tried to laugh it off. After all, he had come here for peace. But slowly, the constant interruptions began to weigh on him. When he sat by the water, instead of enjoying the gentle waves, he worried about whether his chair was placed too close to the edge of his yard. When he planted flowers, he wondered if they were approved colors. It was not the life he had imagined. And yet, despite the trouble, David could not bring himself to give up the cabin. Each morning, when he stepped outside and saw the mist rising over the lake, he remembered why he had chosen this place. The silence between the trees gave him strength. The water, calm and wide, gave him hope. He believed that peace was still possible, even if he had to face challenges. What David did not know was that his story with the HOA was only beginning. Karen's visits would not stop. The rules would not disappear. And soon, his quiet lake cabin would become the center of something much larger than he had ever expected. For now, he simply closed his notebook of thoughts, looked across the lake, and whispered to himself, "This is home. I will not let anyone take away its peace." The sun set slowly that evening, painting the water in shades of orange and pink. David sat on his porch, determined, though unaware of the storm that was already moving toward his quiet life. The days at the lake cabin should have been calm, but for David, they became filled with small battles he never asked for. From the moment Karen introduced herself as the head of the HOA, life took an unexpected turn. What started as one or two comments quickly grew into a long list of complaints. One quiet morning, David was enjoying his tea on the porch. The mist still hovered over the water, and the world felt still. Suddenly, he heard footsteps again. Karen appeared, holding her notebook tightly against her chest. "David," she began, her tone sharp, "the flowers you planted by the door are not on the approved list. Only certain types of plants are allowed." David set down his cup. He had chosen simple yellow and white flowers, thinking they looked cheerful. "They're just flowers," he said softly. "They brighten the place." Karen shook her head. "Rules are rules. You'll need to remove them." David sighed. He wanted to argue, but something told him it wouldn't matter. Karen was not the kind of person to listen. Later that week, another letter arrived in his mailbox. This time, it was about his doc. "Too long," the letter said. "Must be shortened to follow HOA standards." The dock had been David's favorite project. He had built it with care, imagining mornings of fishing and evenings watching the sunset. To him, it was harmless. To Karen, it was another problem. The following days only brought more visits. "Your outdoor light is too bright." "Your trash bin is not placed exactly at the corner." "Your grass is uneven by half an inch." Each comment felt small on its own, but together they created a heavy weight. David began to wonder if he had made a mistake moving here. Was peace possible when every detail of his home was being judged? Still, he tried to stay calm. When Karen arrived, he greeted her politely. When the letters came, he placed them in a drawer, hoping to forget about them. But ignoring the problem did not make it disappear. It only grew larger. One evening, David spoke with his neighbor, Paul, an older man who had lived near the lake for more than 20 years. Paul was kind, with a slow smile and a voice that carried wisdom. "Karen giving you trouble?" Paul asked, leaning on his cane as they watched the sunset. David nodded. "Every day. It feels like she wants to control everything." Paul chuckled softly. "You're not the first. She's been like this for years. Most people just follow her rules to avoid trouble. But sometimes I think she forgets what a community is supposed to be. It's not about control. It's about living together." David thought about Paul's words long after the conversation ended. Community. Was this really community, or just one person's control? The following weekend, David decided to invite a few neighbors over for tea. He hoped to build some friendships and perhaps ease the tension. As they sat on the porch, sharing stories, David felt lighter. There was laughter, warmth, and for a moment, it felt like the lake was the peaceful place he had dreamed of. But once again, Karen arrived. She stood at the edge of the porch, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the gathering. "You can't host meetings without HOA approval," she declared. "And you need to make sure no cars are parked on the street. It's against the rules." The laughter faded. The neighbors exchanged uneasy looks. Some excused themselves quickly, not wanting to face more trouble. David's heart sank. What was supposed to be a moment of connection ended in silence. After everyone left, David sat alone, staring at the lake. The reflection of the moon shimmered on the water, but his heart felt heavy. He had moved here for peace, yet every day seemed to bring a new problem. And still, he did not give up. Somewhere deep inside, David believed that kindness and patience were stronger than rules written in notebooks. He believed that life by the lake was meant to be more than arguments over flowers and grass. As he closed the last letter from the HOA and placed it in the drawer, he made a quiet promise to himself: "I will not let these rules take away the beauty of this place. I came here for peace, and I will find it." But what David did not know was that the real test had not even begun. The endless complaints were only the surface of something deeper. Soon, his little cabin by the lake would become part of a story much bigger than himself, one that even Karen could not control. The wind blew softly that night, carrying the sound of the water against the shore. David sat by the window, tired yet determined, unaware that change was already on its way. David had reached a point where he could no longer ignore the endless notes, letters, and warnings from the HOA. His drawer was now full of papers, each one telling him what he had done wrong. Some nights, he sat on his porch with the stack of letters, shaking his head in disbelief. How could planting flowers, building a small dock, or hosting tea with neighbors be wrong? It was not just about him anymore. Over time, David noticed that other neighbors felt the same way. They were afraid to speak up, but when he spoke with them privately, they admitted their frustration. One neighbor told him she had been fined for having the wrong mailbox. Another said his son's small swing set was removed because it didn't match community standards. The more David listened, the clearer it became. This was not about a few rules, it was about control. And control had gone too far. One afternoon, as David was walking back from the lake path, Paul, his older neighbor, called him over. "You should know something," Paul said quietly. "A U.S. district judge has been looking into the HOA. Some families filed complaints because they felt the rules were unfair. The judge has been gathering information for months." David was surprised. "A judge? Here? Looking into all of this?" Paul nodded. "Yes. His name is Judge Harris. Fair man, from what I hear. If you want things to change, you might want to talk to him. He's been trying to understand what's really happening here." That night, David thought about it for hours. Should he get involved? Would speaking to a judge really make a difference? He wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't remain silent any longer. Too many people were living in quiet fear. A few days later, David made a decision. He invited Judge Harris to his cabin. The invitation was simple: "I'd like to share my experience with the HOA, and perhaps you could guide me." To David's surprise, the judge agreed. On the evening of the meeting, David prepared his small cabin carefully. He cleared the table, placed a pot of tea in the center, and set out the stack of HOA letters. The sun was slowly setting, casting golden light across the water. The lake looked peaceful, as if it were trying to remind him why he came here in the first place. When Judge Harris arrived, David was struck by his calm presence. The judge was not a tall man, but he carried himself with quiet authority. His eyes were steady, his voice gentle, and there was something about him that made people feel at ease. "Thank you for coming," David said, shaking his hand. "Of course," the judge replied with a kind smile. "I've heard a lot about this community. I want to understand it better, not from papers, but from the people living here." They sat at the table, and David began to share his story. He spoke about the flowers, the dock, the tea with neighbors. He explained how every small act was treated like a crime. The judge listened carefully, nodding from time to time, occasionally asking questions. "Do you feel these rules serve the community?" the judge asked at one point, "or do they divide it?" David thought about it. "At first, I believed they might help keep things clean and organized. But now, it feels like they're used to control people. Neighbors don't talk freely. They're afraid of being punished. That's not community. That's fear." The judge leaned back in his chair. His eyes moved to the stack of letters on the table. "You're not the only one who feels this way," he said quietly. "I've received many complaints. Some are small, like yours. Others are much bigger. People believe the HOA is overstepping its authority." David felt both relief and sadness at the same time. Relief that he was not alone. Sadness that so many others had suffered silently. As they continued their conversation, the room grew darker. David lit a small lamp, and the soft glow made the cabin feel warm. The judge asked thoughtful questions about how the rules were enforced, about the atmosphere in the neighborhood, and about Karen herself. "Would you say she listens?" the judge asked. David hesitated. "She listens only to herself. She writes in her notebook, but I don't think she hears us." "Not really?" The judge nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. Their conversation stretched into the evening. Outside, the lake reflected the moonlight, calm and steady. Inside, the two men spoke not just of rules and letters, but of fairness, kindness, and what it truly meant to live in a community. For the first time in many weeks, David felt hopeful. He believed the judge could help bring balance back to their neighborhood. But just as their discussion reached a quiet pause, a sudden, sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Both men looked up. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of the door creaking open. And there she was, Karen, standing at the threshold, notebook in hand, eyes full of suspicion. The door creaked loudly as Karen stepped into the cabin without waiting for permission. Her notebook was clutched tightly under her arm, and her eyes scanned the room with sharp suspicion. The air inside the cabin, once calm and filled with thoughtful conversation, instantly grew tense. David rose quickly from his chair. "Karen," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "what are you doing here?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "I was walking by and noticed cars outside. According to HOA rules, no unapproved gatherings are allowed in private homes. You should know this by now, David. Who is your guest?" Judge Harris remained seated, calm and steady, though his eyes followed her every move. He set down his teacup gently, as if he had all the time in the world. "This is a private meeting," David replied firmly. "It has nothing to do with the HOA." Karen shook her head quickly, almost with a hint of pride. "Everything in this community has to do with the HOA. I need to know exactly what's happening here." David felt his patience slipping. "Karen, this is my home. You can't just storm in and demand answers." But Karen barely seemed to hear him. She had already noticed the stack of papers on the table. Her steps carried her closer, and her eyes locked onto the letters spread before the judge. "What's this?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "Are you keeping records? Are you planning something against the HOA?" The judge finally spoke, his tone even and calm. "Perhaps you should sit down, ma'am. There's no need to raise your voice." Karen turned to him, clearly annoyed. "And who exactly are you to tell me what I should do?" The judge folded his hands on the table. "I am Judge Harris. I've been reviewing complaints regarding this HOA. David kindly invited me to hear his perspective." The room fell silent. For the first time since stepping into the cabin, Karen's face shifted. Her confident expression wavered, though only for a second. She quickly recovered, lifting her chin. "A judge," she repeated, her voice quieter now but still defensive. "So you're investigating us?" "Not investigating," the judge said gently. "Listening. My goal is to understand what's happening here. Many families have shared concerns about the rules. I wanted to hear directly from the people." Karen's hand tightened around her notebook. She looked from the judge to David, her mouth pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, she said nothing. David used the silence to gather his courage. "Karen, this has gone too far. You've turned simple homes into places of fear. People don't feel free to enjoy their own yards or plant their own flowers. They don't feel like neighbors anymore. They feel like prisoners of rules." Karen's eyes flashed. "Rules are what keep order. Without them, people would do whatever they want. The neighborhood would lose its beauty, its structure, its value. I've worked too hard to let that happen." The judge's voice was calm but firm. "Order is important, yes. But order should not destroy peace. Community rules are meant to bring people together, not drive them apart. Karen opened her mouth to reply, but the judge raised his hand slightly, stopping her. I've spoken to many families, ma'am. What I hear is not harmony. I hear fear. That is not the purpose of an HOA. That is the misuse of authority. Her face grew red, and she clutched her notebook closer, almost like a shield. For once, Karen did not have a quick answer. David watched her closely. Beneath her stern expression, he saw something else, something like doubt. It flickered only briefly, but it was there. The judge leaned forward, his voice softer now. Karen, rules are not meant to make people smaller. They are meant to guide people toward living well together. But when rules become walls instead of bridges, the heart of the community is lost. The room grew very quiet. The sound of the lake outside drifted through the window, the gentle ripple of water against the shore. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Karen lowered her eyes. I only wanted things to be perfect, she whispered. Her voice, for the first time, carried no authority. It carried something almost fragile. David felt his chest tighten. He had never heard her speak like that. The judge nodded slowly. Perfection is not control. Perfection is kindness, respect, and balance. Perhaps it's time to listen, not only to rules, but to the people who live under them. Karen's grip on her notebook loosened. She glanced once more at the letters on the table, then turned toward the door. Without another word, she stepped outside into the night air. David let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The judge remained calm, sipping the last of his tea. She will think about this, Judge Harris said quietly. Storms often come before change. David looked out the window at the lake. The water reflected the moonlight, calm and steady, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The cabin was quiet after Karen left, but the silence felt heavy. David sat back down, his hands still tense from the encounter. Judge Harris, however, remained calm. He sipped his tea, as though everything had gone according to plan. She will return, the judge said softly. Sometimes truth needs time to sink in. David wasn't sure. Karen seemed too stubborn, too sure of herself. He had seen her argue with neighbors for hours, never once admitting she was wrong. And yet, there had been something in her voice, something fragile that gave him hope. 2 days later, David found out the judge had been right. It was late afternoon when he heard another knock at the door. This time, it was not a storm but a gentle tap. David opened the door cautiously. Karen stood there, holding her notebook, though her posture was different. She looked tired, almost uncertain. May I come in? She asked quietly. David hesitated but stepped aside. Inside, Karen did not march around as before. She sat down at the table, placing her notebook in front of her but not opening it. Her eyes lingered on the stack of letters David had left there. I suppose, she began, you think I'm the villain here. David said nothing. He wanted to hear what she had to say. Karen sighed, her shoulders lowering as though a heavy weight rested on them. I've been leading this HOA for years. When I first started, people were careless. Yards were messy, houses looked neglected, and the lake path was full of litter. Nobody cared. I thought, if I could enforce rules, everything would become better. Cleaner. Safer. Perfect. Her voice cracked slightly, though she quickly steadied it. And at first, it worked. People painted their houses, cleaned their yards, and the place started looking beautiful. I thought I was doing the right thing. David leaned forward. But at what cost, Karen? People are afraid to live freely. Neighbors avoid each other. The beauty you see is only on the surface. Beneath it, there's fear and silence. Karen pressed her lips together. She seemed to know his words were true, though it was not easy for her to admit it. Before David could continue, there was another knock. This time, when the door opened, Judge Harris stepped inside. His timing was almost uncanny, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "Good evening," he greeted calmly, looking from David to Karen. "I see you decided to return." Karen nodded slowly. I needed to understand. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said." The judge took his seat at the table, folding his hands neatly. His eyes were steady but kind. "Then let us talk openly. No notebooks. No defenses. Just truth." For a moment, Karen hesitated. Then she closed her notebook and pushed it aside. The judge began gently. "Karen, I've reviewed complaints from many families here. The patterns are clear. Your intentions may have started with good reason, but the result has been harm. Rules meant for harmony have become tools of fear." Karen lowered her gaze. "I never wanted fear. I only wanted pride in this place." "Pride should come from belonging," the judge replied softly. "Not from pressure. Not from punishment." David listened carefully. This was the first time he saw Karen without her armor of authority. She looked smaller now, like a person who had carried too much for too long. The judge continued, his tone thoughtful. "Leadership is not about controlling every detail. It's about guiding with fairness. It's about listening. Do you know how many neighbors feel unheard?" Karen's eyes glistened as she whispered, "Too many." Silence filled the cabin once again. The sound of the lake drifted through the window, steady and calm, as if nature itself was listening. David spoke softly. "Karen, no one wants to fight you. People just want freedom to enjoy their homes. We came here for peace, not punishment. If you truly care about this place, you'll see that." Karen closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was no fire, no anger, only weariness. "I see it now. I see what I've done. I thought order was everything, but maybe I lost sight of the people." Judge Harris leaned back, his expression unreadable yet calm. "Acknowledging the truth is the first step. Change can follow, if you choose it." Karen nodded slowly. She reached for her notebook, not to write, but to hold it loosely in her hands. "Perhaps it's time I use this differently. Not to record rules, but to record voices. The voices of the people who live here." For the first time since meeting her, David felt a sense of hope toward her. Maybe she wasn't simply a strict enforcer. Maybe she was someone who had gotten lost in her own idea of perfection. The judge rose from his chair. "Then let us see what change looks like. The lake deserves peace. The people deserve it too." Karen stood as well, her face softer than David had ever seen. She didn't speak further, but her silence carried something stronger than words, a beginning. As she left the cabin, the evening sky turned golden, and the lake shimmered with gentle light. David stepped onto the porch, watching her walk away. For the first time, he believed things could truly be different. The storm had not fully ended, but a path toward calm had begun. The days after the meeting at David's cabin felt strangely quiet. Karen no longer knocked on doors with her notebook in hand. She was seen less on the lake path, and neighbors noticed the absence of her sharp voice reminding them of rules. For the first time in years, the community seemed to breathe freely. But for Karen, silence was not peace. It was reflection. She sat on her porch one evening, staring at her closed notebook. For so long, it had been her constant companion. Every page was filled with notes, complaints, and reminders of rules. It had been her tool of control, her way of shaping the neighborhood into what she thought was perfect. But now, looking at it, she felt only heaviness. She remembered Judge Harris's words, "Rules are not meant to make people smaller. They are meant to guide people toward living well together." Those words echoed in her mind day and night. She thought of the neighbors who avoided her, the gatherings that ended in silence, the smiles that faded whenever she appeared. Was that truly the community she had built? One morning, she decided to walk the lake path without her notebook. She wore no stern expression, only quiet thought. To her surprise, people looked at her differently. Some nodded politely, while others gave cautious smiles. A few even stopped to chat, though their voices carried hesitation, as though unsure if they could trust this new version of her. Karen listened. Truly listened. A woman named Linda told her about the stress of receiving constant letters. A young father explained how his children missed their swing set that had been taken down. An older couple shared how they felt they could no longer decorate their porch without fear of breaking a rule. Each story touched Karen more deeply than she expected. She had thought she was protecting the neighborhood, but she realized she had been protecting only her vision of it. The people themselves had been left behind. That evening, Karen sat at her kitchen table with her notebook open in front of her. But instead of writing new rules, she began a new list. At the top, she wrote, "Voices of the Community." Underneath, she wrote the names of the people she had spoken with and their concerns. For the first time, the notebook felt lighter in her hands, not a weapon, but a tool for understanding. Meanwhile, David noticed the change too. He had expected Karen to return with more demands, but instead, she stayed quiet. When he passed her on the lake path, she greeted him with a small nod instead of a lecture. It was unusual, almost unsettling, but also hopeful. One afternoon, Judge Harris visited the lake again. He met with a group of neighbors at the community center. Karen arrived too, though she sat quietly in the back at first, listening more than speaking. The judge began the meeting by reminding everyone why they were there. A community is not about perfect houses or perfect lawns, he said. It's about people who respect one another. It's about kindness, fairness, and balance. Neighbors shared their stories, much like they had with Karen in private. Some spoke with frustration, others with sadness. As Karen listened, her chest tightened. Each voice was like a mirror reflecting back the truth she had tried to ignore. Finally, she stood up. The room grew quiet. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I thought rules could bring perfection, but instead they brought fear. I see now that I stopped listening to you. For that, I am sorry." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Some people looked at her with doubt, others with cautious hope. Karen continued. "I don't want to lead through fear anymore. If I remain part of this HOA, I want it to be different. I want the rules to protect peace, not destroy it. And I want to hear your voices, not silence them." David, sitting near the front, watched her closely. He saw no trace of the stern woman who had stormed into his cabin with authority. Instead, he saw someone humbled, someone beginning to understand. The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Acknowledgement is the beginning of change," he said. "But true change is shown in actions." Karen lowered her head. "Then I will show it." After the meeting, neighbors approached her cautiously. Some offered polite words, others simple nods. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was a step forward. That night, as Karen walked home, she looked at the lake reflecting the stars above. For years, she had thought perfection was about clean lines, painted fences, and silent order. But perhaps perfection was really this: neighbors sharing laughter, children playing freely, and the water shining under the night sky. For the first time in many years, Karen smiled to herself. It was a small smile, but it was real. And though the journey was far from over, the storm inside her heart had begun to clear. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the lake community had seen before. The heavy silence that once hung over the neighborhood slowly lifted. Instead of worried whispers about fines and warnings, there was laughter from porches and gentle conversations along the lake path. Children played again without fear of being told they were too loud, and neighbors began to greet one another with warmth rather than caution. David noticed the difference most in the mornings. When he stepped onto his porch with his cup of tea, the lake seemed brighter. Birds chirped more cheerfully, and the air felt lighter. The peace he had dreamed of when he first bought the cabin was finally becoming real, not just for him, but for everyone. The change did not happen overnight. Karen still carried her notebook, but it was no longer filled with lists of violations. Instead, she used it to record ideas from neighbors. She visited homes not to lecture, but to listen. At first, people were hesitant, unsure if they could trust this new version of her. But little by little, they began to see the difference. One afternoon, she knocked on David's door again. This time, her voice was soft. "I wanted to ask your opinion," she said. "We're planning a community event by the lake, a picnic for everyone. No rules, no restrictions. Just people together. What do you think?" David was surprised, but he smiled. "I think it's a wonderful idea." When the day of the picnic arrived, the lake shore was alive with color. Families brought blankets and baskets of food. Children ran across the grass, their laughter echoing against the water. Neighbors shared dishes, told stories, and for the first time in years, the community felt like a true family. Karen stood quietly near the edge of the crowd, watching. She was not the center of attention anymore, and she did not need to be. Instead, she felt joy simply seeing others happy. David approached her with a plate of food. "You did well," he said gently. Karen shook her head. "No. We did this together. I only opened the door. Everyone else walked through it." As the sun set that evening, Judge Harris arrived to join the gathering. People welcomed him warmly, thanking him for guiding the change. He spoke briefly, reminding everyone of what truly mattered. "Rules can guide us," he said, standing near the water, "but they should never take away the heart of a community. What makes this place special is not perfect fences or painted porches, it's you. The people, the kindness, the shared laughter. That is what will keep this lake beautiful." The crowd clapped, not loudly, but with genuine appreciation. Later, as the stars appeared in the night sky, David sat on his porch once more. He could hear distant voices from the picnic, still carrying across the water. He thought back to the day he first moved in the dock he had built, the flowers he had planted, the hope he carried. He had nearly lost that hope under the weight of endless rules. But now, it felt stronger than ever. Karen, too, walked home that night with a lighter heart. For years, she had believed control was the only way to keep things perfect. But now, she saw that perfection was never about control. It was about connection. It was about neighbors smiling at one another, children playing freely, and people feeling safe in their own homes. She had not been a villain, but she had been lost. And now, she was finding her way back. The judge left the lake community a week later, his work complete. But his words remained, carried like seeds in the hearts of the people. Change was not just possible, it had already begun. Seasons passed. The flowers David planted bloomed brightly by his door, untouched by complaints. His dock stretched into the water, a place of peace and rest. Neighbors gathered often, whether for tea, fishing, or simple conversation. And when Karen walked the path, people greeted her not with fear, but with respect. She was no longer the storm of the lake. She had become part of its calm. One quiet evening, as the sun painted the sky in orange and gold, David looked across the water and whispered the words he had spoken to himself long ago, "This is home." And this time, the words carried no doubt, no fear, only peace. The lake, once troubled by storms of rules and conflict, now reflected harmony. Its surface was smooth, its breeze gentle, and its shores alive with laughter. The storm had passed. And in its place, Brighter days had truly arrived.